Since most of you in this room don't know me, I think I should start by giving you my credentials. Specifically, my inspiration credentials. Those that I think qualify me to speak on the assigned topic of inspiration. Because you certainly can't be taking inspiration advice from some rando from another office. So, here they are. At the tender age of 11, I participated in a youth soccer camp. And yet, at the end of this camp, given the age we live in, there were a lot of trophies handed out, mostly of the personality variety. So, most fun, nicest, coolest hair, which isn't personality per se, but arguably can substitute for one with a pinch. I, myself, took home one of these trophies, the Most Inspirational Player Award, which you see right there. So, now that you can all take me seriously on this subject, let's begin the presentation proper by asking the following question. In your view, is inspiration more of an emotional quality or an analytical one? So like if someone says, I'm feeling inspired, do you take that to mean that they're feeling optimistic, their hopes are high, the sky's the limit, that sort of thing? Or do you take it to mean that they've carefully analyzed the situation and available evidence suggests that the outcome they desire is now notably more probable than they had previously forecast? Let's do a quick show of hands here to see what you folks think. There's going to be eye clickers at some point, but for technical reasons, we'll stick with a show of hands. Let's do, raise your hand if you think inspiration is more of an emotional thing, optimism and hopes. Need for that, okay? I'm seeing a lot. Let's switch to analytical. Any souls who think that this inspiration is more about analytical? Very brave. Now, when I see that most of you, again, with that exception, put inspiration more in the emotional camp, and this is the intuitive response, absolutely. But when I said that this wasn't a trick question, that did not mean that I was going to agree with the majority answer. In this presentation, I hope to inspire you to change, specifically to change how you think about inspiration itself, which is super meta, I realize. I hope to convince you to consider inspiration not just as an emotional quality, but also, perhaps even primarily, as an analytical one. And I'll discuss some takeaways for companies and also for our personal lives. And perhaps consider advocating that you could take into account this analytical approach and perhaps bring your goals closer in reach. And as you saw at the beginning, we are also in this presentation supposed to incorporate the firm's vision and values, skills and competencies, and 2018 goals for the firm or our department. So as I go through, I want you to just keep an eye out for those things. See if you can spot them. So it's now time to introduce to you a patent-pending paradigm of inspiration that I came up with that is definitely not an attempt to pander to the judges by repurposing Fisher terminology. It goes like this. Inspiration moves on the gap between people's expectations and their goals. To put this another way, it moves on the gap between what people want to achieve and their perception of the odds that they will achieve it. So, when the gap narrows, people are happy, they perceive their goals as closer. Conversely, when it widens, people are sad, they perceive their goals as further away. And when the gap narrows unexpectedly, as a surprise, then people are inspired. Their horizons are expanded. New frontiers of possibility open up before their suddenly hopeful eyes, etc. And it's all about that gap between expectations and goals. And we're going to return to this idea frequently throughout the presentation. Now, next, in my view, there are three basic approaches to inspiring people. First, you can expose the audience to a previously unknown, but surprisingly achievable goal. Tell them you or we are on the cusp of greatness, or perhaps we already are great, just didn't know it yet. Second, you can take a desirable but definitely distant goal and argue that and convince the listeners rather that it's closer, it's more achievable than they previously thought. Likely because the listeners' talent and grit and unstoppable team spirit will be more effective than they previously thought at getting there. Both of these approaches narrow the gap between expectations and goals and are therefore inspiring. The third approach is a little different. I like to think of it as negative inspiration. This says, look, our initial/lofty goals are so far out of reach, there's no point even talking about them anymore. And instead, we should be talking about survival and the terrible consequences that await if we don't turn this thing around. Doesn't sound very inspiring, I realize, but by reframing the goal as something way lesser, way easier to achieve. You have still, in a sense, narrowed the gap between expectations and goals. Now, inspired people are going to be more productive in general. And this means that every company, every manager has an incentive to inspire their employees. For example, and this among the many forms this can take, employees might be inspired by the fact that they are bettering the investment universe. Or perhaps they might be inspired by the chance to cultivate a global strategic mindset while managing complexity and focusing on the client. They might also take inspiration from the opportunity to help drive the firm towards its 2018 goal of 10% organic growth. And heck, this goal might even cascade down to individual departments' goals, thus allowing employees throughout the firm to be themselves, driven by better. Now, I am being just a touch facetious here, as you can probably tell, but crucially, insofar as this presentation is about inspiration as a concept and goals as a concept, then you can really apply the material in it to each and all of the things on this slide. And I think this idea will become even clearer as we continue. So let's continue with the next key concept, which is this. Because most people think of inspiration primarily in emotional terms, aspiring leaders often lean on emotional calls to action when trying to rally the troops. And this is all well and good in, say, sports, and like a locker room setting, where emotion and confidence are so key to performance out on the field. And all it might take is a short-term boost of energy and enthusiasm to carry the team to victory. However, this approach isn't nearly so well suited, in my view, to the corporate world. Here's why. Sure, you can probably rouse the employee base by hyping what we can achieve if we all work together as a team and focus on what's best for the customer, that sort of thing. But will the ensuing burst of excitement carry over into the following days, weeks, and months of questionably inspirational day-to-day tasks? Probably not. And I'm not arguing, by the way, that there's no place for encouraging employees to work together as a team and all that. Certainly not. It's a balance, though. And I think if you want to avoid settling for that short-term emotional high, then you need a healthy dose of the analytical approach to inspiration. But what is this analytical approach? And how does it work? In my view, the analytical approach seeks to narrow the gap between listeners' expectations and goals through well-supported, clearly articulated arguments. It might include a clear description of the goals, path to achieving them, over what time span, at what cost, given what obstacles, and so on. Maybe these obstacles are smaller than most people think, or the time span is shorter, or our success is substantially dependent on things within our control, such as the great service we offer, the wonderful people who work here, and the will-do attitudes that keep this place running. Who's with me? These people are too. I put them there in reserve in case you folks weren't. But anyway, the point here is that this analytical approach to inspiration, I think, can still be inspiring. And crucially, if inspiration stems from solid, convincing analysis, then I think it lasts longer than the type born of an emotional high. However, as shocking as it might seem, the firm's progress towards its 2020 vision, or even its 2018 goals, don't necessarily dictate employees' happiness and fulfillment on a day-to-day basis, particularly when those employees are not at work. So let's turn now to part two of this presentation, which asks the question of how this whole expectations versus goals business applies to our day-to-day lives. First, because the need for most people to study their goals and expectations is important, I think, because very few people do it. I think most people have a pretty good sense of their goals, but few have a solid grasp of their expectations, which is that crucial other half of the expectation, of the inspiration equation. And this is understandable, because expectations are fuzzy things and difficult to pin down. But I think you should try to do so anyway. Here's why. If something inspires you, if you say, wow, I had no idea my goals were so close, or that I actually have what it takes to achieve them. If you have an inspiring revelation of this kind, then in a sense, something has gone wrong. Specifically, you. You were wrong. You might have been ignorant of important information, either about your goals or yourself, such that your expectations of what you could achieve were way off. I mean, if you weren't so wrong, and if the initial gap between your expectations and goals weren't so wide, it might not have been possible to inspire you in the first place. So then we have to ask the question, why was that initial gap between your expectations and goals so much bigger than reality warranted? Why, in short, were you susceptible to inspiration? Possibly, though by no means necessarily, this could be because you neglected to do the difficult analytical work of examining your goals and your expectations and using fact and evidence to understand the gap between them. And in my opinion, understanding this gap is important because it helps you avoid what I call the roller coaster of inspiration and disillusionment. Just a quick reset here. Inspiration is what happens when the gap between your expectations and goals suddenly and surprisingly narrows. Disillusionment then is the opposite of this. It's what happens when the gap between your expectations and goals suddenly and surprisingly widens. And the roller coaster is what happens when you cycle back and forth between the two based on whatever the latest encouraging or discouraging news happens to be. And here's what this process looks like. Let's watch. And so this is not a fun experience. As any of you who perhaps might have spent some time on this roller coaster in a test. So then we have to ask yet another question. Who is on this roller coaster? Who is at risk? In my view, these might be people who don't know themselves, their capabilities, or how feasible their goals are. And as a result, they often pursue goals with very low odds of success. And so they fail, probably a lot. And so they become disillusioned, perhaps to the point that they lose faith in their ability to do even very achievable things. The gap or the between their expectations and their goals fluctuates wildly because they're unable to control it. And they're unable to control it because they don't know what it's based on. They don't know what they can do now, or what they could do if they perhaps tried a little harder, or what they couldn't do even if they did try harder, or what their time and talents are best spent on, given the opportunity costs of pursuing this goal versus that one. It's a sad situation. But it describes all of us to an extent. No one knows themselves totally. But some, I think, know themselves better than others. Because as with most things, this is something that you can practice. You can put effort into. You can improve it. So building on this idea, and in conclusion, I want to offer you 5 sayings. The first comes from ancient Greece, and it's the very simple command to know thyself. Or to put that into more modern / Fisher-friendly terms, do some introspection. And as a random, kind of funny quote I read somewhere goes, if you don't know what introspection is, better take a long, hard look at yourself. The third saying is my attempt to improve on the wisdom of the ancient Greeks, which I don't think smacks of hubris at all. It goes like this. If you wish to know thyself, know thy expectations, know thy goals, and know the gap between them. And you can tell, by the way, that this is a very sage remark, because I used the word thy 3 different times. I'm sure thy minds are blown. The point here is that when you go through this process, whether you discover that the gap is bigger than you thought and you're disillusioned, or it's smaller than you thought and you're inspired, in either case, you'll have confronted reality and yourself, and hopefully you'll be the better for it. The fourth saying takes us back to ancient Greece, as it's generally attributed to Socrates. Quote, the unexamined life is not worth living. But could we introduce a corollary to this? A fifth and final saying, that the unexamined goal is not worth pursuing. But what is an unexamined goal but a dream? A distant objective that you hope to achieve, but have no realistic plan or knowledge of how to do so. And am I really going to stand here in this last round on inspiration and tell you folks not to follow your dreams? No. I'm not going to do that, because that would make this the least inspirational speech of all time. But I will say this. If you have some dreams, and I hope you do, examine them, interrogate them, see if you can make plans, assess costs, engage probabilities. In short, see if you can turn those dreams into goals, which maybe you find out you can't, at least not right now. Maybe it turns out your dreams are so far distant that you despair of ever reaching them, and you have to get some new dreams instead. This could happen. Who am I to say? But by going through this invaluable process of examination and planning and analysis, you might find that your dreams, or should I say, your new goals, are a lot more achievable than you previously thought. And what could be more inspiring?